Imagine this. It's the late 1800s. It's France, and two brilliant minds are locked in a battle that could redefine how we fight illness. One says germs are the enemy, invading armies that must be destroyed. And the other counters, no, it's the battlefield itself. Your body's inner world, that's what decides the war. Now, fast forward all the way to today, and this debate is hotter than ever, especially after pandemics and rising chronic disease. What if the way we've been chasing viruses and bacteria is only half the story? What if nurturing your body's terrain could prevent sickness altogether? Well, welcome to the Jake Woodhouse podcast. I'm Jake. I dive into ideas that shape the world all around me. I want to know what's important to me and then the decision making I can make as a result. Now, as an investor, I'm always investing in three key areas: humanistic, intellectual, and financial capital. Today's episode, and in particular as a homeschooling dad, is going to highlight a key debate and how we might invest in our health and our children's health. So a topic that broadly is covered by both humanistic and intellectual capital. Now, like many of you, I'm always questioning, how does the world work? I love to be curious. And what a confusing world we have today. I'm going to dedicate this episode to my wife, Loz, who mentioned this topic a week or so ago. And I was just like, what are you talking about? And in I dove. And it's quite incredible what you can find out in a fairly short space of time. So in an investor's lingo, like, where is the signal in all the noise? So what is it I'm talking about? Well, we're going to unpack germ theory versus terrain theory. It's an epic clash of ideas on why we get sick. We'll cover the history, the key players, their strongest arguments, some juicy quotes, some hard data, and most importantly, how this all plays out in daily life. Now, whether you're aiming for optimal health and vitality, or you're just trying to teach your kids about what's best for them, this topic, and it has for me already, could totally change how you approach healthcare. Indeed, it's amazing to me that I'm only just digging into the details now. So stick around, and by the end, you'll have tools to make smarter choices for you and your family. Now, as we run through this, if you have any questions, then please do reach out. hi@𝐄𝐏𝐈𝐒𝐿𝐿 is my email. And I'd love to know, like, what's more important in your eyes? Is it the germ theory or is it the terrain theory? Now, I always encourage people, if you're listening on podcast player somewhere, switch over to something like Fountain, so a Bitcoin and Nostr focused podcast player, and hit me up with a boost or a comment on that platform. Or equally, and my favorite, get yourself a Nostr account, an NPub and an NSEC, decentralized communication protocol. I love it. Fire off some zaps, I'll send them straight back. So let's jump in. Let's set the stage. And it's always fun to dive into a bit of history. But this isn't some like really boring, dusty textbook tale. It's full of a few twists and turns, some drama, rivalry, politics, and paradigm shifts. And it's still, amazingly, it's still incredibly relevant today, far more so than probably what it should be. So our story kicks off in the mid-19th century, so around 1850s, and we're in France. Now, at the time, there were cholera outbreaks, poor sanitation, and there was a scientific revolution underway. And enter a man named Louis Pasteur. He is the grandfather of germ theory. So born in 1822, it says, his title, so to speak. So Pasteur was a chemist and biologist who proved that microorganisms caused fermentation and spoilage. He developed pasteurization, so heating liquids like milk to kill bacteria, and pioneered vaccines for rabies and anthrax. Now, his big idea: diseases are caused by specific germs invading the body from outside. This was revolutionary. No more blaming of the bad air or humours. Now it was possible to target the culprits. Now, just to spend a moment here, so bad air, this is something called miasma theory. And so before germ theory, many people believed diseases were caused by miasma, so foul or polluted air emanating from rotting matter, swamps, or unsanitary conditions. The idea: dating back to as old as ancient Greece, persisted all the way through till the 1800s, held that inhaling these noxious vapors caused illness like cholera or the plague. Humours, again rooted in ancient Greek medicine, so this is Hippocrates and Galen. The humoral theory claimed health depended on balancing 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Imbalances caused by diet, environment, or emotions were thought to trigger disease. And I mention that because obviously setting the scene as to like what was common at the time or what was thought of as like perceived wisdom, it changes through history, right? Try and put yourself back in those shoes. So humours, imbalances caused by diet, environment, or emotions were thought to trigger disease. But, and this is where this starts to get a bit spicy, Pasteur was not the only person alone in the lab. He had a contemporary and a rival, Antoine Béchamp. So Béchamp was born in 1816, lived to 1908. He was a French chemist and biologist, and he proposed something radically different: terrain theory. Béchamp argued that microbes aren't fixed enemies, they're pleomorphic, meaning they change form based on the environment. He discovered tiny particles he called microzymes, or microzymas, I might be saying that incorrectly, in cells, which could evolve into bacteria or viruses if the body's terrain, i.e. its internal balance of pH, nutrition, and toxicity, wasn't aligned. Now, he discovered this using high-powered microscopes and was examining living tissues, blood, and decomposing matter. Now, in his studies of chalk from geological deposits and living organisms, he observed minute granular particles that appeared to be alive even in ancient fossils. Now, he called these things microzymas, from the Greek small life. These particles, they were distinct from known bacteria, as they seemed to persist across various conditions and transform based on their environment. Béchamp, he wrote a book, The Blood and Its Third Element, in 1869. And the quote, microzymas are the organized ferments, the primordial elements of all organized matter. Interesting, right? And just to obviously highlight there, a certain type of microscopic lens just didn't exist before this point, and hence it was possible to actually discover these things. So pleomorphism suggests microbes are dynamic, adapting to the body's condition, and may not always be harmful. That's very different, isn't it? Disease, Béchamp said, starts from within, not from an external attack. So supporting Béchamp was Claude Bernard, born in 1813, died 1878. He was a physiologist who emphasized on the internal milieu, i.e. the body's fluid environment. Bernard's work on homeostasis, aka the body's self-regulation, laid the groundwork for viewing health as balance, not warfare. Now, this timeline, you can feel these characters, they've got very different opinions. It really heats up in the 1860s through to the 1880s. Pasteur and Béchamp, they clashed publicly, having arguments, and Pasteur, backed by the French Academy of Sciences, ran experiments showing germs cause disease, like injecting healthy animals with pathogens to make them sick. Béchamp countered with studies on silkworms, claiming diseased terrain allowed microbes to thrive. So they're obviously a bit of a tit for tat, right? So which one is going to win here? Now, politics played a role. Pasteur's ideas aligned with emerging industries, while Béchamp's were harder to monetize. Interesting. This sounds slightly familiar to a recent scenario I found myself in. We will get onto that later. So in 1876, a man named Robert Koch, a German physician, born 1843, died 1910, he entered into the fray on Pasteur's side, and Koch's postulates, 4 criteria to prove a microbe causes a disease, solidified germ theory. So Koch and Pasteur, they jumped into bed together. A big old hoo-ha. So 4 rules to prove a microbe causes disease. This is Koch's postulates. Find it in all sick cases, not healthy ones. Isolate it in a lab. Infect a healthy animal to recreate the disease. Then re-isolate the same microbe. So he did some experiments on anthrax and tuberculosis that absolutely nailed it through this process. So 100% of infected animals got sick, 0 controls did not. And his quote, "The bacillus is the cause." And in this case, Bacillus anthracus is what's being referred to. So it's the anthrax causing bacterium. It led to vaccines, clean water. They managed to slash cholera deaths by 50%. Koch, he identified bacteria for anthrax, tuberculosis, and cholera. And in 1905, he earned a Nobel Peace Prize, or a Nobel Prize. So by the 1890s, like, germ theory just absolutely dominated. It cleaned up, basically. And it's unsurprising when you mentioned that incentive earlier as to like who they might align with in terms of how to monetize, etc. We'll dig into that a little later. But so here is the big plot twist, though. On his deathbed in 1895, Pasteur reportedly said, "Bernard was right. The microbe is nothing. The terrain is everything." Pasteur is just admitting that. On his deathbed, what are the things you wish you did in your life? It's like, you know what, this guy I've been up against my whole career, he was actually right. And it suggests, of course, that Pasteur saw the bigger picture than just focusing on the germ. Now, is this a genuine admission or just a spicy rumor? Like, I'll never know, right? I can't go and ask either of these dead men what is true. But it spices things up a bit, right? So historians, of course, they still debate this. It fuels terrain theory advocates to this day, in spite of germ theory, and it's still true now. It's true in the late 1800s. Today, germ theory is the hands down winner. Like, I don't honestly know many people that have even talked to me about terrain theory before. Now, how did this really bed in, so to speak? So in 1910, the Flexner Report, which some of you may have heard of this before, it was commissioned by Andrew Carnegie and strongly influenced by John D. Rockefeller. It standardized US medical education around germ theory. And what this meant is they shut down holistic schools teaching nutrition and homeopathy, paving the way for pharmaceutical dominance. This is not an episode about the Flexner Report or the kind of history of all of this per se, but go and have a listen to my episode with Sarah Valentini, an absolutely awesome homeopath that we use. And she talks a little about this in our episode. And I really enjoyed learning, where did homeopathics come from and why isn't it more relevant today than it perhaps could be when we found it to be so valuable? Now, going all the way back, early 1900s, Rockefeller's got this huge oil empire, and he's trying to figure out, how do I create more products? And that's where synthetic drugs come in, right? So they're sidelining natural terrain approaches that couldn't be patented. So in the 20th century, germ theory has absolutely hammered it. And it's true, antibiotics like penicillin, discovered in 1928, have had a huge impact and supposedly saved millions. Vaccines eradicated smallpox in 1980, or so they claim. And terrain theory just kind of lingered in alternative circles. And what's really brought this back up? So two major things of the last 50 years, AIDS, really fueled conversation around terrain theory. And more recently, the COVID-19 scamdemic, as I would call it. And, quite rightly so, these things have come into question because when you look back through the history, the guys that are talking about terrain theory almost 200 years ago now were simply pointing out that there must be some reason why not everyone catches a disease. What can it be? So, and again, we'll discuss this as we go through the episode. So to spend a bit of time on the modern day, some characters that my wife mentioned, and again, shout out to 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐄, she's awesome at researching the health space and creating what's the right way of saying this? She's revolutionized how I think about health and what I eat, and equally what our kids eat and the medications that we take and all the rest of it. So shout out to her. And this episode is dedicated to you, 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐶𝐶, if you ever listen to it. So the first guy, Dr. Tom Cowan. Now, he's been a long-time advocate for terrain theory and uses his work to kind of dismantle germ theory. And he frames germ theory as part of a broader, quote, make-believe science, disconnected from observable reality. Cowan challenges foundational pillars of mainstream medicine, particularly virology and genetics, whilst promoting a holistic and environment-driven model of health. So what is his core critique? Well, he's he calls it flaws in virology. But to explain that a little more, so unstable paradigms built on manipulated methodologies like cell culture, like cell cultures and antibody testing, that misrepresent how illness occurs. He argues that viruses aren't proven causative agents, but artifacts of poor science, echoing Béchamp's pleomorphism from 200 years ago, where microbes are symptoms of internal imbalance, not invaders. Now, of course, this ties directly to terrain. It's like disease stems from the body's terrain, not external contagion, i.e., the toxicity, the nutrition, the emotional state of a person. Now, he's got a podcast. I was able to find a quote from his podcast, which, what if the immune system and antibodies are misunderstood concepts? Illness isn't about fighting germs. It's about the body's response to imbalance. Interesting. So in terms of genetics and heritability, he really flips this idea of, in terms of nature versus nurture in the debate on, he's rejecting genetic determinism, i.e. cancer genes. And he just calls them fatalistic myths. Instead, heredity is environmental and educational. Now, passed down lifestyles shape terrain more than DNA. This empowers personal responsibility. Of course, that's something that draws me into this conversation. Like people taking responsibility for their choices, for their body, for their outcomes, their results. So Cowan would argue that you detach from outcomes and seek truth in health. He's got a book, Cancer and the New Biology of Water. And in that, he even extends this to oncology in general. So cancer isn't a genetic or germ-driven war, but a terrain collapse from dehydrated, polluted cells, treatable via hydration, minerals, and lifestyle, not chemo. Cowan says germ theory misses why some resist infection. Like, why don't some people get sick and others do? I.e., the terrain matters. Now, the second character from a more modern era, Dr. Andrew Kaufman. In this case, he's a forensic psychiatrist and is very much a health skeptic. So when I was reading about him, he was described as a firebrand against germ theory. So he insists that it's a manufactured narrative. It props up Big Pharma and is used for control. Well, I'm interested in anyone that's putting those things together. Like, that's not the future I want to live in, not the future I want my kids to live in, like more control and a lack of bodily autonomy. So he claims that these viruses don't even exist. Contagion is a myth, and that health is 100% terrain dependent, shaped by toxins, not transmission. So what's his core critique of germ theory? Well, he repeatedly debunks virology as a pseudoscience built on dead cells and manipulated microscopy. He exposes how research uses stained, lifeless samples, creating artifacts mistaken for viruses. And he's influenced by a guy I came across as well during research with someone called Harold Hillman. And he posed the 47 unanswered questions to prove biology's house of cards. He was a British guy born 1936, died 2016, a neurobiologist and professor at the University of Surrey. And he was radically critical of cell biology and argued that much of modern biology relies on artifacts from preparation techniques. As you go down these rabbit holes, like why, who, what's the incentive? And it's very clear to me quite quickly. It's like germ theory, lots of incentive to paint and make money. Terrain theory, individual accountability. I know which side I'm leaning towards, right? You can make your own mind up. But if the foundation of modern biology is built on research using dead cells, then the conclusions we've been taught are deeply flawed. That seems like a reasonable point, doesn't it? It's like, what are you putting under your microscope, mate? And these lab testing scenarios supposedly proving the theory that you're putting forward. It's like, how are you actually doing that? And I love these debates, right? Let's get to the truth if we can. So Kaufman argues no natural virus has ever been isolated, making bioweapons or outbreaks like totally impossible. Now, his terrain emphasis, like disease, for example, autism or cancer, is environmental poisoning, not genetic or infectious. Quote, autism is not genetic. Conditions like autism and even cancer are the result of environmental factors and toxins. Interesting. So obviously, prevention is much more important from the perspective of both Cowan and Kaufman, and they really focus on things like detox and nutrition. How patentable is a detox? Like, mate, go on a water fast for 5 days, see how you feel. Now, leaving behind now the history lesson and some of these characters, I want to spend a bit of time breaking down, like, okay, what are these two camps really talking about? And think of this as like the elevator pitch for each one. So to start with germ theory, there's basically 3 main points, like pathogens are the primary cause, transmission is key, and interventions target the germs. So firstly, just to talk through pathogens as the primary cause, like specific bacteria, viruses, or fungi invade and multiply, leading to symptoms. Koch's work showed Mycobacterium tuberculosis causes TB in over 90% of cases without prior exposure. Okay, so some proof, right? Transmission is key. So diseases are spread via contact, air, or vectors. Pasteur, quote, I have demonstrated experimentally that the virus of rabies can be transmitted from one animal to another. And admittedly, this led to hygiene revolutions, and people washing their hands reduced maternal mortality by 90% in one particular case. Like, okay, people didn't used to wash their hands. Maybe there's some merit to that, right? And so pathogens are the primary cause, transmission is key, and finally, interventions target germs. So what do I mean by that? Well, specifically vaccines, train immunity against specific invaders. Antibiotics kill bacteria. And the evidence for this would be, I mean, the World Health Organization data. How much do you trust that after the last 5 years' experience? But global vaccination campaigns dropped polio cases from 350,000 in 1988 to 22 in 2017. And it's funny that the pro-vax camp almost always cites polio as the reason that vaccines are good. Now, of course, if you question why a child needs to have 60 jabs before the age of 12, like polio is just one example, and that data set's from 1988 to 2017. Like, what's the case today? And when my wife and I, for example, was researching that topic, there's not one study on a child with no jabs and a child with all the jabs. Doesn't exist. Every single vaccination for an infant gets tested independently, but without them being done in conjunction with all the other ones. Like, talk about, that doesn't make sense, right? How can you tell me that my child is guaranteed to be safe after all of those injections? And funny enough, no one has an answer to that. More on this in a second. And so to get back to terrain theory, what are their core arguments? Well, again, 3 main points. The body's environment dictates disease, focuses on holistic health, and prevention is done through lifestyle. So, okay, well, that's very different, right? So in terms of the body's environment dictating disease, so a healthy terrain, so I mean balanced pH, strong immunity, low toxins, prevents microbes from causing harm. Béchamp's microisms, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, microzymas, yeah, that's better. Béchamp's microzymas theory, microbes are symptoms, not causes. They morph in response to imbalance. Interesting. So point number 2, so focuses on holistic health. Disease thrives in bad soil, poor diet, stress, pollution. So Bernard said, the constancy of the internal environment is the condition for free and independent life. Now, what data is there to back this up? Well, studies on the microbiome show that bacteria imbalance, like dysbiosis, links to 70 to 80% of immune issues. That's some research done by the NIH. Point number 3, prevention through lifestyle. So you build resilience with nutrition, exercise, and detox. What evidence do we have this works? Well, 2016 study in The Lancet found lifestyle factors, aka diet and activity, prevent 80% of chronic disease such as diabetes, far more than vaccines alone. Now, this is interesting, right? Another data point. US chronic illness in kids jumped from 1 to 2% in the 1960s to 40 to 50% today. Now, this correlates heavily with processed foods and environmental toxins, not just germs. Well, what's the truth? Like every story, there's probably some middle ground. There'll be a bit of truth on one side, a bit of truth on the other, probably. But that's what we have to figure out, and that's what I'm going to do for the rest of the episode. So a lot of experts, they'll say integrate both, right? So use antibiotics when needed, but prioritize terrain to avoid even being in the situation where you might need to use a kind of germ theory focused intervention. Now, just to walk through, like, what do I think about this, and what are some of the things we can do? So, and to summarize, like, how does this ancient debate hit home for us today, especially in light of being a homeschooling dad. Like, what do I want to teach my kids? How do I have to think about looking after my kids to keep them as healthy as possible? And as I did this research, I just had so many questions about previous, like the experience of the last 5 years and the COVID stuff. It was just wild. Now, and the questions this throws up are huge, right? So how on earth did the COVID-19 and all those lockdown, that craziness, how did it actually happen? Well, in a sense, it's obvious because it's a lot to do with incentive, right? But when you look at like the hard facts, like who was dying? Now, putting aside the fact that the common cold in the data that was collected by the health services of most major countries, the common cold disappeared, and suddenly there was lots of deaths from COVID-19. That statistic manipulation conversation aside, like the people that died were over the age of 80, and they had a handful of comorbidities, like 3 or 4 comorbidities. So why in the hell was it the case that a vaccine was pushed as the only solution? And you take into account this whole camp of terrain theory. It's like, well, it's obvious, right? They were making money out of it. And a better piece of advice would have been like, just tell everyone to be healthy, aka a terrain theory focus. Like, sort your lifestyle out, sort your diet out, like do a detox. These are far more effective ways of protecting yourself from anything that you might come across in your life. And the implication obviously is money. So at the start of this episode, we touched on the fact that when this original germ versus terrain theory debate came up in the 1800s, one side, i.e. the germ theory side, was more easily monetized and the other wasn't. And so you wonder why today, 150 years later, you've got a government that is the apparatus of a massive industry that has self-regulated itself such that it doesn't get any, like, vaccines, you can't sue them. Like, what is that? The government pays out if there's any kind of contraindication. Isn't that extraordinary? So, like the very simple question, okay, there's a disease going around that's a threat to everyone. Okay, well, is it to everyone? No, it's actually to a handful of people in their later life with comorbidities. Great. If it was a threat to anyone else, what's the most easy entry-level protection for them? Oh, well, have a look at your diet, have a look at your lifestyle, make sure you're super healthy, you'll probably be safe. That doesn't sell, right? Now, and the next thing here is it like really quite comes into question this whole idea of like informed consent. And the vaccine business is very clever in how it manipulates the scenario and claims that no one ever has a vaccine unless they have it with informed consent. Now, how does a 3-day-old child give informed consent? It can't, right? So that's already like a major falling apart of first principles thinking. But then also the very aggressive like carrot versus stick approach that was used by governments in lockstep with vaccine businesses to say, you're not allowed to go and work unless you get this jab. You're not allowed to go to a cafe unless you get this jab. You're not allowed to go to the sports game that you love unless you get this jab. It's like, it makes a complete mockery of informed consent. Like, all these people apparently had informed consent, but they couldn't get paid unless they did it. Like, again, red flags, right? So and to reflect on myself here, I didn't even know about terrain theory really until 10 days ago. And doesn't it make a lot of sense? Like, focus on yourself first. Make sure that you're doing as much as you can to be as fit, as healthy as possible. Be balanced, as was described as being important. And then you'll likely be totally fine from any disease. Well, that's the best protection you could ever get. But I guess the problem is that people don't like taking responsibility for themselves. They prefer to pop an Ozempic pill than get on a treadmill, as an example. Or they want Big Daddy government to tell them they're going to be safe the whole time. It's like, no, that's on you, mate. Again, difficult to patent motivation, like personal motivation. So where am I going with all this? So information doesn't travel through markets fairly. And I know that well from an investor perspective. And in particular, like the bet, if we want to call it anything else, that I'm making on Bitcoin, a lot of people don't even know about Bitcoin, let alone why it's the best bet you can make. And so in this case, it's simple. Like, the germ theory prevailed as a as a common wisdom because the information about germ theory was better spread, more widely spread. Now the incentive's clear, right? You spread this information and then you make money. But isn't that an interesting thing to come across, right? Now, one core problem I had with the COVID era was this idea of like public health policy is more important than individual choice. A classic ethical debate on the collective versus the individual. But how convenient that the germ theory like camp is able to sit in this public health space and be like, oh, well, we know everything because we've run all these tests and we've used this German guy 𝐂𝐲's 4 postulates from 150 years ago to prove that we've isolated this disease and now we've recreated it and we can solve everyone's like terrifying future by just taking this little bit of medicine. And it's like something I completely agree with, right? If I can't decide on what goes into my body every day, which is the ultimate property right, then what is freedom? I don't have a right. So is public health policy more important than individual choice? Well, that's already a great debate. But then you throw into the mix this whole concept of germ theory versus terrain theory, and you're like, well, that throws up the conversation even more, right? Because maybe germ theory is not even correct. And the optimal way of keeping a healthy society is focusing on terrain theory. Had terrain theory been taken seriously, there'd be no need for a vaccine. There'd be no need for lockdowns. There wouldn't have been any disruption. Like, why would you have done any of that to save a tiny portion of the population that also might just be better off with terrain theory as a way of looking at their health, right? 80 years old, get outside, eat a better diet, stop taking all that medication, see what happens. And it's so convenient, isn't it? The collective is guilt tripped by the people making money. Like you're being manipulated, right? And this idea that, if a car is faulty, they've got to recall the car. Like I literally took my BMW into the workshop this week because they recalled it to replace a part. If a vaccine business gets caught creating a product that creates harm, it's the government that steps in and pays the bills. Well, I thought the government represented the people. So the taxpayer foots the bill. So you're socializing the losses. Extraordinary setup. And it's unbelievable to me that people actually kind of are okay with it. And so much of this stems all the way back to 100 years ago and that Flexner Report and the oil business getting involved in modern healthcare. Like you're digging stuff out of the ground and selling it as an energy product. And they were looking for ways of like, obviously, creating more. And that's where it ended up. So interesting, right? Oil is in most of these pharmaceutical products. Perhaps I'll go into more detail on the Flexner Report in another episode because I think that'd be really interesting to learn more about. But if you cannot live by my body, my choice, then what do you have? And so, and again, more questions that came up for me. So first principles perspective. I always love thinking like this. You don't need any data in many ways. It's like, okay, so how is it the case? Well, ask this question first. How do I protect myself from sickness? And the germ theory camp and the terrain theory camp, it's quite clear to me which camp I would prefer to go down. It's like, well, hang on. So you just take accountability for your lifestyle, for your diet, and you want to try and have as healthy a body as possible. Those are all things I can work on. Whereas the germ theory is like, okay, well, I've got to try and isolate this germ somewhere, and I've then got to trust other people to have the expertise and the product to protect me from it. But the sovereignty aspect of that, it's very clear. Terrain theory is the way that I would go. And the same applies with my kids. But what terrain theory so clearly highlights, which I think makes a complete mockery of the supposed COVID-19 pandemic and the reaction to it, was that if two people are exposed to the same bacteria, one gets sick and the other doesn't. Why is that? Like, seriously, why is that? Why can it be the case that, and even that I see this happening at the moment with, I've got 3 children, one of them will get sick and then all 3 of them have been with each other the whole time in whatever different locations we've been to. It doesn't make sense. Why aren't all 3 of them sick at the same time? And it would make much more sense that one of them was out of sync somehow, maybe a little bit too tired or ate something that they didn't agree with, and they were not pumping on all cylinders and therefore developed some kind of illness. And so it's like, all this stuff about I mean, here in Australia, they had a COVID-0 policy. Like, how insane was that? You've got to lock the whole place down so that not a single person gets this specific bacteria that you're supposedly going to save so many other people from. That doesn't make sense. And especially when it's like, how do you explain that two people might get this COVID bacteria and one of them be totally fine and the other one not? Like, someone explain that to me, please. And to me, germ theory just completely falls in its ass at that point, because you don't need all these products that the germ theory can provide, when terrain theory is a much more accessible and obvious option to take. So it's pretty glaringly obvious in that sense. And how convenient that terrain theory is swept aside. Again, as I was researching this, you learn so much, don't you? But it occurred to me that this is very similar to what I've witnessed in the world of economics and the discussion of sound money versus inflationary monetary policy, and the Austrian economics of the last 150 years that was essentially hidden from me by what is the Keynesian dominant economic model of today. And it's like, hang on, I didn't even know Austrian economics was an option. What do you mean there's a form of money called sound money that stores value over time? No, that's not right. No, money is something that the government controls via central bank, and they have an interest rate, and they can increase or decrease the cost of lending depending on how hot or cold the economy is, and they help to include unemployment in that. And it's all about the government controlling the money system. Like, that's a Keynesian philosophy of inflationary monetary policy. I didn't even realize that sound money existed as an option. And this is kind of the same. It's like, no, germ theory is like, that's what life is all about. Germ theory. And then it's like, no, there's this thing called terrain theory. And actually underneath it, it's not aligned with the incentives of modern government and big business. And it's actually far more practical and requires people to take accountability for their own choices. And they can't just buy a solution from someone else. Oh, that resonates really strongly, and also gives me a lot of power. Like, how empowering is that? When you go, okay, for me to be as fit and as healthy as possible over the next 50 years of my life, I should just follow a terrain theory concept. It's like, keep myself fit and healthy, I'll be totally fine. And I've got plenty of friends that are like, I haven't been sick for years. And they might be like pretty much carnivore. They might have given up drinking. They might be, whatever they might be doing. But they're certainly not munching down pharmaceutical pills following the status quo food pyramid that the government tells them to abide by. Like, it's ridiculous, right? So, a bit of reality check. When the insiders for a particular theory, like germ theory, make money, like, what a surprise that drives everything. Now, I have to mention this whole concept of a government official standing up on a stage with a government-approved journalist interviewing them, talking about trust the science, trust the experts. What an absolute load of bullshit. So it really should be like, trust the scientist that is paid by the company that vouches for germ theory, that has robustly protected itself from any cost downside, and is due to make gazillions of dollars from you accepting what you're telling them. Right? And so from a sovereignty perspective, it's like, no, fuck off. I'm not going to just blindly trust the experts. And once again, I've come across a subject where, when I dig a little deeper and I hear about this thing called terrain theory, it's got an extraordinarily powerful background to it that has been hidden from the average eye. Very convenient. And it's the kind of thing, Jake's such a conspiracy theory. Sure, maybe in this case. Or just, when I read this stuff and when I start thinking about it, it's like, I actually completely believe in terrain theory over germ theory. How is it that I can go into a room, be totally fine, not be sick, and then one of my family members falls sick from that same experience? That doesn't make sense. Anyway, I'm going to rely on myself to keep myself healthy going forward. I can detox, I can follow a good diet, I can exercise, I can work on my lifestyle. Stress reduction even. It is not anyone else's responsibility but mine and mine alone. Now, another serious question that comes up through this, and I think is very valid, is this idea of, using 𝐂𝐿's 4-point process. And, the end of this process means that they can then patent a medical product. But and this is where I think this really came up or flared up in COVID-19. It was very much squashed, right? You couldn't find this information. What if they never isolated COVID-19? Like, seriously, was that actually isolated properly? And did they genuinely take it through 𝐂𝐿's 4 steps? And if they didn't, and they were doing all those rapid antigen tests, what were they even testing for? Now, I'll never know the answer to that, to be honest, and very few of us ever will. But what a scam, stoking up all that fear, flooding the media, like the eyeballs of the populace just got assaulted. I remember having one morning where I woke up and I was walking around the local area of Melbourne in full lockdown, and people were wearing masks, and there was "Get Vax" signs on the local pharmacists. There was "You can't come into the cafe unless you've been vaxxed" at the local, coffee shop. I couldn't go to work because I wasn't allowed. I pick up my phone, and Telstra, the mobile operator, had a "Let's Vax" instead of the 4G, 5G sign in the top corner. You turn on the TV, and the AFL would be put on, and there'd be a beer advert that involved getting jabbed. There'll be some kind of Government of Victoria advert about getting jabbed, and you get in the car and you switch the radio on, and there'll be some kind of advert about how you need to go and get your vaccine. It was just the most extraordinary marketing campaign ever conducted. That was like, you need to be terrified, you need to be terrified, you need to be terrified, but guess what? We've got the solution. And not once is terrain theory mentioned, right? Not once is there the more balanced approach of like, well, by the way, there's actually two theories at play here. One's germ theory. If you follow that, come this way, there might well be a medicine that you can take. But actually, you should also take note of terrain theory, because in terrain theory, it's much more focused on individual choice, and actually having a safe and healthy body yourself is the best protection. That would be informed consent, right? So what a mockery that concept is. So I'm going to be much more wary of this going forwards, and I really love this idea of terrain theory. Now, I touched on this very briefly before, but like the infant vaccine program today is very different to what it was when I was a child. My wife and I came to the conclusion that we didn't want to follow what the Australian government was recommending us, and that's taken us down a whole new journey and an unexpected route. I'll do a whole nother episode on that. If people are interested, please reach out and let me know. But what is a more practical approach? The terrain theory approach, where it's like, okay, make sure the baby has the safest possible pregnancy, make sure it's birthed naturally, make sure it's breastfed, make sure it has as much parent contact as possible, make sure that the mother in particular is as healthy and as vital as it possibly can be, and that's going to keep your baby safe and healthy. Terrain theory. Or the flip side of it, germ theory, you actually need to infect your child with tiny amounts of these different diseases, of which no one has ever done a study of all of them given to a child together. Like, come on. And if it goes wrong, it's not our fault. Like, okay, sorry. And what you're saying is if I don't take that option, I cannot access the publicly funded childcare system. Yes, that's correct. And it's like, whoa, that is crazy, right? And here in Australia, there's a policy called no jab, no play. And you can't take your toddler to a childcare class because you haven't done what the infant vaccine guideline was. So lots of red flags there. I'll do another episode on it some other time. But as I said before, I'd much prefer to trust myself than a company or a politician to, trust the experts. And so the final part of this, I want to just think through like how this manifests in daily life. And, I'll move on from the rant of the lack of informed consent. To me, this really just empowers critical thinking and is all about education. So, how do you teach your kids about science? And is it the case of being like, okay, well, guess what? Germs are bad and vaccines are good. Or one more on the lines of like, okay, well, guys, why do you think your sister got sick and you didn't? And it's a great way to obviously weave in like why eating healthily is so important. Now, in my case, my kids aren't really quite old enough for this, but could easily spark some experiments, like, for other homeschooling dads that might be out there. Track the family's health during a week of eating specifically healthy food versus a week of junk food. Show your kids the data, right? Why does a balanced diet have 30% fewer infections? And it's a good way to weave in a history lesson. Like, do you know who Louis Pasteur was, or Béchamp? Which one is more relevant today, do you think? Can you debate germ theory versus terrain theory? Again, my kid's a little too young for this, but at some stage I'd for sure be weaving this in. And this, of course, shifts health decisions. It's like, is getting the vaccine necessary, yes or no? And then like the further question is like, how else can I protect myself or my kids from any supposed health threat? And now germ theory is we do this every day. We get in from wherever we've been and we wash our hands. Cool. So I can use parts of the germ theory camp to improve my life. And the other side of that being terrain theory and nutrition. And every single day we are trying to eat as much as possible organic and organic and whole foods, right? Home cooked. So we eat lots of meat, we play outdoors, we have almost zero screen time, we homeschool, so there's as much primary caregiver contact as possible. And as I mentioned before, we haven't followed the infant vaccine guidelines of the government. So without realizing it, I was already advocating for terrain theory. I enjoy quotes. So Béchamp, disease is the crisis of a purifying process. So when a kid gets a fever, it's not panic mode, it's actually the body detoxing. That's a cool concept, right? It's like when you're sick, it's actually really important to be sick because that's the healing process. So you don't want to just get rid of the sickness. You want the sickness to be there as long as it's necessary. And so inflammation is actually a good thing in that sense. You've got to let it play out. You've got to feel the pain. And it's all part of the healing process. So an observation I've definitely made when I go to playgrounds and stuff with my kids, I've seen how much healthier they actually are. Now, some of you might be like, Woodhouse, you're biased, get over yourself, get over the fact you've got kids. Okay, maybe. But I'll go to a playground sometimes and I'll hear this hacking cough. And I'm like, oh, that is a heavily vaxxed childcare child. And I will actively try to make sure my kids don't get too close to them because they get sick from them. Now, that's terrain theory in a sense, but also germ theory. But we are not putting our children into 10, 12 small children class of kids that have all been pumped full of specific diseases that they might have never been anywhere near. And we did that for a reason because we don't think it's good for holistic health. And it's interesting, like I sometimes see kids in the playground that I can tell that they are fully up to date on their infant vaccine schedule, and they're almost a bit like kind of glazed over. They're just not they're just kind of sedated. It's really intense. And for any parent that's chosen to go down that route, I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I just have major question marks about it myself. An interesting stat to keep in mind. So the US health rankings dropped from 6th in 1990 to 27th in 2016, despite it being a germ-focused spending program. Isn't that interesting? So dropping from 6th in the world to 27th, and they're focused all around germs. So why neglect terrain? Maybe that would help to turn that trend. What is the reward for taking terrain more seriously? Well, a resilient family. My kids will get to self-learn. They won't be scared. I won't be scared. And I'll be just more aware of the propaganda, right? It's propaganda with an agenda. They make money from selling this stuff. And so, when they say you're going to be happy and own nothing, well, sure, bullshit. Or when they say, you're going to have to eat the bugs, like, no, I'm not. And unsurprisingly, there are two sides to every coin, and there's different ways of thinking, and there's different ways of turning up in the world every day. Final part of this episode, and then we'll wrap it up, is just trying to put into practice some of these concepts. Like, how might you do that? First and foremost, like, why homeschool, etc. This proves a point in a brilliant way, which is that with AI, I was able to research a discussion and a debate that I didn't know much about, and come to what I think is a balanced approach in terms of the information provided, but then I can make my own conclusions. And that to me is what education is. It's like collect the information around a problem that you've got and then make a decision for yourself. And I know that I can help my children learn to do that from home far better than any teacher ever will that I might outsource them to. And they can do that themselves using AI on a smartphone. So any information they might need is at their fingertips. So why would you send them off to a school for 10 hours a day to sit in a room that they don't want to be in, where they can't play ever, and learn a load of stuff that could be looked up on a phone in 20 seconds? That is such a waste of their time. And if time is the most scarce asset of a human, then you are wasting your child's most important capital, which is their time. Okay, a daily life like tie-in. So imagine doctors thinking smelly air made you sick. Spark a discussion on how the science has evolved, miasma, humours, germ theory, terrain theory, and you could have an experiment. So, have kids track how fresh air, i.e. open windows versus nutrition, affects their energy or colds, and then blend in miasma ideas with terrain principles. Some data, like studies show good ventilation reduces respiratory infections by 30 to 50%. Now, that's a big shift, right? Just from ventilation. And make this into a lesson. So, test ideas, balance the idea of hygiene with holistic help, versus more of a germ stuff. So another time, so pleomorphism is or can be used for a hands-on science lesson. So teach kids that microbes aren't just bad guys, right? But part of a dynamic system. So as an experiment, you could grow your own yogurt, right? Your yogurt cultures at home. So a safe bacteria that thrive in milk's terrain to show how environment shapes microbes. And weave in then things around diet. So cutting out sugar keeps the terrain strong. So, and good data point here. So 2016 study found low sugar diets reduce candida overgrowth by 60%. And that's just through tying, through having an understanding of pleomorphism. Cowan said, illness is the body's attempt to restore balance, not a battle against invaders. Really good theme there. So what would you do? Well, you're going to empower your family to focus on nutrition and stress management and reduce fear of germs. Another daily life tie-in that I want to add. So 𝐄𝐏, we mentioned before, his 4 postulates about isolating, etc. So it's a teachable moment. It's a science project. Can we prove a germ causes a cold? Like, why do some classmates get sick and others don't? Introduce a terrain theory. So track family hand washing versus diet. Like during the flu season, like what actually happens? Have you managed to stay sick-free through the flu season? So 𝐄𝐏's inspirational quote that I have, so the bacillus is the cause, we mentioned this before, versus Cowan, so illness is the body's response, not a germ's attack. So which one's right? And test it on yourself. What I really liked about Cowan and his approach is this idea of teaching kids resilience rather than fear. So using diet and detox as a way of creating a strong terrain to avoid this idea of like germ phobia. Everyone's so scared of germs. Like, no, you don't need to be scared of anything. Just make sure that you and your body are fit and healthy. Because there's no doubt, like the trend for chronic disease is massive, right? Like 40 to 50% of kids have chronic diseases. And why? Well, it's obviously a failure in terrain. So modern toxins. Oh, it's absolute madness, to be honest. And so we mentioned as well Kaufman. So his questioning of germ theory, it basically collapses the medical industry overnight, in his opinion. Like if there's no fear, then why would anyone take any of these medicines? And that's the nefarious side of it, right? Is playing on fear. So for families out there and homeschoolers, like we want to raise terrain-based children, right? Unprocessed foods, critical thinkers, free of chronic disease, and it's clearly possible, right? And so what I learned out of this is terrain theory is a field of thought that makes a lot of sense, that was hidden from me largely, I think, due to the lack of information spread by the misalignment of the germ theory camp. One must always try to be as balanced as possible. So there's some truth in everything. I truly believe that. And therefore, the process here is like just make up your own mind. I believe this to be true, like the terrain is everything. And it's probably how I was already living my life. I just didn't really have a phrase for it. Always ask questions, like always. We should not be afraid in the slightest. This concept of like blindly trusting the experts, well, it just doesn't make sense. So I will never, ever, ever do that. We should, of course, incorporate experiments. Like do it, trial it on ourselves. Think from first principles. Like the aim is to thrive. And as a homeschooling parent, it's like, what is the optimal 25-year-old look like? How do we get them there? So I hope by sharing all of this, first of all, it was a selfish project in a sense. I was able to completely upgrade my knowledge first and foremost, but it's it's helped me increase or improve my capital stock in terms of humanistic, aka health, and intellectual capital. So I hope it has for you as well. And as the audience members, as I said at the very start, like, what do you think? Like, how has germ theory impacted you? How has terrain theory impacted you? Do they make sense? Shoot me an email, hi@jwoodhouse.io. If you've made it over onto Nostr, then I would absolutely love to get a zap from you, and I'll zap you straight back. And for any homeschoolers out there, like, what works for you guys? And what am I missing? That's a general question. I'd love to know more. So thank you so much for tuning in today. Really appreciate your time. Reach out if I can help with anything at all.